Morning, everyone. This is Robert standing in for Mike with your morning briefing for Tuesday, 20 May 2025. Let's get started on our daily domestic sit rep. Ray Dalio, who's legendary fund manager, said yesterday that Moody's downgrade of the U.S. credit rating last week actually understates credit risks. He says this because Moody does not rate the risk that the U.S. inflates the debt away, only if it will pay the debt. And he said, quote, said differently, for those who care about the value of their money, the risks for U.S. government debt are greater than the rating agencies are conveying. And yesterday, former Treasury Department official Jim Milstein also came out and said that lawmakers are risking a fiscal disaster if a recession hits the U.S., while Republicans are trying to make tax cuts permanent through their budget reconciliation bill. And he added that the bond market pushing yields sharply higher would it be worth it to convince lawmakers to bring the deficit down because, quote, there's really no check on lawmakers right now. And as far as I've seen, Trump is actually going to Congress today to urge House Republicans to pass this budget reconciliation bill, which has been held up over some disagreements between the more moderate Republicans and our more right-leaning Republicans in the House Freedom Caucus. The DOJ is also investigating the Coinbase data theft that happened over the weekend. And this is according to a person familiar with the matter. They said the DOJ is opening an investigation into the data breach. And according to Coinbase, these hackers, they bribed overseas customer service representatives to steal customer data rather than just cryptocurrency. As far as I understand, according to what Coinbase has put out, they then used that customer data to social engineer some of the Coinbase customers to steal their cryptocurrency. This is a major development because this is, there have been historically, especially in Northern Europe, where some of the Scandinavian countries have very robust public information laws, public financial data laws that have allowed robberies to happen. So this could lead to some Coinbase customers who have a high amount of cryptocurrency on their exchange, could lead to some robberies and actually put them in physical danger. And that's what's happened in Northern Europe for the last few years. I think in Sweden, especially, there have been some high-profile cases of home invasions and robberies over the public availability of data of cryptocurrency holdings. The Association of Port Authorities, which represents about 81 ports across the U.S., warned that a proposed 100% import tariff on Chinese-made cranes could cost U.S. ports $6.7 billion and also scale back port modernization plans. And according to this association, U.S. ports currently have 55 of these Chinese-made cranes on order, and they're expected to need an additional 151 of these Chinese-made port cranes in the next 6 to 10 years. This was actually at a hearing with the U.S. Trade Representative Office yesterday, and they're proposing this 100% import tariff on Chinese-made cranes. And as we've pointed out previously, these cranes have been a subject of argument in the U.S. government over the last few years because they do represent a major threat, cybersecurity threat, and potential threat to U.S. supply chains. The U.S. Department of Agriculture announced yesterday in a notice to the Federal Register that they're dissolving 7 advisory committees, and this includes 2 important committees: the National Advisory Committee on Meat and Poultry Inspection and on microbiological criteria for foods. These committees advise the USDA on safety, inspection policy, and regulatory oversight. And the USDA, as well as the FDA, have been dealing with issues with food inspection over the last few years. A Government Accountability Office report actually found that the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service had a lot of problems with conducting inspections and reporting problems since going back at least to 2017. And then finally, in the domestic sit rep, a panel of judges from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled yesterday that the Trump administration should facilitate the return of a 20-year-old Venezuelan national that was deported to El Salvador. And I think this is clearly setting up another point where the courts are kind of putting the Trump administration in a contempt trap where they're setting up another possible point where the Trump administration could defy the courts simply because they are telling the Trump administration that they need to engage in a foreign policy matter, and the El Salvadoran government can simply deny the return of this Venezuelan national as they did in the Abrego Garcia case. Moving on to the global sit rep, if Jerry can come on and run us through your items for today.
Absolutely. So the State Department yesterday announced new sanctions on Indian travel agencies. They're on the agencies, their owners, the executives, and senior officials. And all of this is for facilitating illegal immigration to the United States. And now, the Indian and United States governments are reportedly working together to identify the human smugglers here, this term used by the State Department, and those facilitating illegal immigration. And the Philippines continues to find Chinese underwater drones. This is coming from the Philippine Coast Guard. Yesterday, they said that they have found so far at least 6, possibly 7, coming from China, and these have all been in Philippine waters. And later this year, Taiwan's going to send a few delegations out. One of them will be to the U.S. to study the National Guard mobilization process. They'll also be sending at least one to Europe to study the reservist and civil defense structures, particularly with lessons learned from the Ukraine war. And staying in the EU, the European Union's Council and Poland, the current president of the EU, agreed to roll out an electronic external border security system to track who's going in and out of the European Union. Now, this system is going to be phased in over the next 180 days to collect fingerprint and face data to find out, who all is actually coming in. And this is actually kind of a fortuitous follow-up to a question we had yesterday about whether or not the tides of immigration are actually changing. And lastly, down in South America, the State Department is offering a $10 million bounty for any information regarding Hezbollah's activities in the tri-border area of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. So they are trying to actually squash that. And moving on, we've got another piece from Rob.
So yesterday, the acting U.S. attorney for the District of New Jersey, her name's Alina Habba, she announced that her office is pursuing criminal charges against Representative LaMonica McIver, who is that New Jersey Democrat that had a confrontation with ICE agents at the Delaney Hall Detention Center in New Jersey on the 9th of May. In response, House Judiciary Committee Democrats said that charging members of Congress for conducting oversight investigations is a dangerous precedent and, quote, reveals the increasingly authoritarian nature of the Trump administration. And as we've previously reported, criminal charges against McIver could be an accelerant for the Trump Resistance 2.0 if the Trump administration does follow through. Something else interesting going on in parallel to this is that the Trump DOJ appointed officials they're considering changes to policies that will require U.S. attorneys to get approval from the DOJ's public integrity section for criminal charges against federal lawmakers like this, which I think is likely a move to circumvent some of these career DOJ officials and employees who would oppose the Trump administration pursuing criminal charges against lawmakers. And if the Trump DOJ officials do change these policies, I think the Trump administration could expand the use of criminal probes into Democratic lawmakers, especially over Democratic resistance to Trump's deportation agenda. Then moving on to our next item, the Department of Energy yesterday over the weekend invoked the Emergency Federal Power Act, and they ordered the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, also known as PREPA, PREPA, to restart operations of 35 fossil fuel power generators across 11 major power plants on the island. They also issued an emergency order in parallel with this. It's directing the power authority to clear vegetation overgrowth along 66 high voltage power transmission corridors, which they said have caused 23 power interruptions on the island over the last year, with 2 major ones both in February and April that led to island-wide blackouts. I think this is important because I've read through both these 2 orders and previous DOE invocations of the Federal Power Act over the last 10 years. And what sticks out to me about this is that, one, this was not, as far as I can find, formally requested by Puerto Rican authorities. And in fact, earlier this year, I think in March, both Puerto Rican authorities and some federal lawmakers actually pressed the DOE to to issue emergency renewable funds for solar power. And this is also, as far as I can find, in the last couple of years, the first time that this Federal Power Act has been invoked to bring specifically mothballed fossil fuel power plants back online. So I think the Trump administration could use this emergency power through the Federal Power Act as a potential pathway to address grid fragility elsewhere in the U.S. by ordering some of these retired coal and gas power plants back online in the near term. Because the Federal Power Act does allow the Trump DOE to circumvent environmental laws and renewable energy mandates and can be renewed every 90 days. So I think we could see in the coming months more invocations of the Federal Power Act by Trump's Department of Energy to try to shore up some of the shortfalls that we have in the different grids across the United States, especially as we've seen utilities and state level officials continually warn that we have a generation shortfall in a lot of the grid infrastructure across the U.S. Jared, if you could come on and take us through your item for today.
Absolutely. So Vietnam signed a nuclear agreement with Westinghouse Nuclear, pretty major American nuclear specialist. Now, this is to restart the nuclear power plant plan that Vietnam had until about 2016, and this is also to help rebalance the trade deficit with the United States. Westinghouse is going to build on a previously scrapped plan in Vietnam to bring 2 nuclear power plants online, and Vietnam actually signed a similar agreement with Russia, the Russian company Rosatom, back in January. Now, this I think is significant for 2 reasons. First off, this is actually a significant milestone in developing plans for other nations to also reduce their trade deficit with the United States. That's been pretty much the thing driving the Trump administration to issue tariffs worldwide. So here, everybody's been trying to look for, hey, how do we stabilize the international trade? This is a good way to do it. This is what Vietnam's trying to do, and as a large chunk of the trade deficit, saying, hey, we want you to bring nuclear power here. I think that will work, and it will probably be replicated in other areas. Maybe not necessarily with nuclear, but conducting these very large investments. Now, additionally, on the grand stage, Vietnam signing with the U.S. and Russia signals neutrality, but it also isolates China. China technically should be a rising star for international nuclear power cooperation because they're, at least on paper, the leader for small modular reactors. But here you see one of their actual neighbors sharing a border with them, as you can see up north there, that China's not being pinged for this. I think that's going to signal to a lot of other nations that are looking for a greater nuclear power to actually start reaching out to people other than China.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Do we have any questions that came in yet?
We have had none come in today. We did have one from yesterday that showed up on the Early Warning Network. Let me pull it up.
I did see a comment from Frozen Nomad. Fun fact, the crypto term for robbing people of their crypto by attacking them in person is wrench attacks. Yeah, that's what I think is actually, there's been a lot. I've seen some speculation of theft of crypto directly from Coinbase, directly from these exchanges. But I think the most likely danger is that actual physical attack on people who have crypto on the Coinbase exchange who've had their data stolen. And that's what I was pointing out, is that this has been a long time issue in the Scandinavian countries where they have robust public record financial record laws that as I've been seeing for a couple of years now, at least, crypto guys from Sweden, for example, complaining about the availability of this data to criminals, and they've been experiencing home invasions. Some people, as far as I understand, over the last couple of years have even left and basically eaten the exit tax that's imposed on them over this, because they would rather pay that exit tax and physically live outside of those countries just because of the danger of that type of attack. All right, go ahead and bring up that question, Jared.
Yes. So this is from Omega Joe over on the Early Warning Network. he said Brazil. This is regarding the corridor from Brazil to the Tranque port in Peru that China is negotiating with Brazil in order to shorten their supply chains. He says Brazil's a big country. Where is this railway to Tranque supposed to originate from? And I've been tracking the bioceanic road corridor for a while from Brazil. That's, I think, the top contender because it's already heading to the Pacific coast of South America for several different ports in Chile, particularly. But that would cut through Paraguay, Argentina, Chile, and obviously Brazil. So it's just a matter of getting it into Peru, which is not far from there.
All right, and then from Brian Edminster, how quickly can a mothballed fossil power plant be brought safely back online? It seems the legislators are expecting to just flip a switch. I'm not sure in the case of some of these generators on Puerto Rico how quickly they can bring them online. I think some of them have actually only recently been shut down. And I think a lot of that has to do with Puerto Rico has a clean energy mandate like some U.S. state or like many U.S. states. And I did see some comments from the current governor. Actually, they've been discussing rolling back those mandates, pushing it back because they had a certain benchmarks of clean energy as a percentage of their grid they had to meet by this year. And then I think 100% by 2040. And they're already talking about rolling that back. And they actually, so the Puerto Rican governor actually praised the Department of Energy for doing this. And I think they're from what the Puerto Rican government has said, the idea is that basically ordering the DOE ordering them to bring back a lot of these 35 fossil fuel generators just guarantees enough stability for them to start repairing and enhancing their grid and making some infrastructure upgrades that they haven't been able to do because they've been dealing with these power failures over the last 2 years roughly. And a lot of it also comes down to maintenance. That's why the DOE is ordering them to cut a lot of that overgrowth that's hitting those transmission lines because they've been really lax on maintenance. And as far as I understand, that's actually one of the main causes of the most recent island-wide blackout was that they had not been conducting maintenance on transmission lines. And it was actually like with the Spain blackout Spain and Portugal blackout that happened a couple of weeks ago. It was a similar issue. There's just not enough dispatchable power on their grid. And then because of lax maintenance, one accident on a transmission line, on a key transmission line, shut down the entire island. I think the timetable for this, the DOE, I would expect, they wouldn't come online instantly. I'm sure they're going to be, bringing these power plants back online over the next 90 days. And the DOE can just renew this emergency order basically every 90 days. And I think they also require a progress report basically on how they're doing at the end of ahead of that 90-day deadline. And looking back at the other invocations of the Federal Power Act, some of them were extended multiple times recently during the first Trump administration. And I would expect the DOE is probably planning, or the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority is probably planning on a longer timeline than 90 days to bring all that power back online.
Robert, do you know how long it takes to get from no power plant to a functional fossil fuel power plant?
As far as like building it from scratch?
Yeah.
Probably not as long as a nuclear power plant, obviously, because that runs into some issues. I think when we talked about that Vogtle power unit in 2023, that was like 10 years behind schedule, and I think it took like 20 years to get that new generator online. I think a lot of that comes down to permitting issues. Probably not just in like environmental impact issues, which can take years. They're supposed to take an environmental impact review. I believe the intent of that law is to take like a year or like 6 months, but they often go way beyond that. Then you have the actual physical construction of the power plant, and then they have to get into what's called the interconnection queue on whatever the grid is, the grid operator, whether it's an independent system operator or a regional transmission organization. And like the PJM, for example, that's the big regional transmission organization that covers the Atlantic coast out to some parts of Illinois and down as far south as some parts of South Carolina. Their interconnection queue is years long, so they actually have a lot of power generators just sitting there that are, in some phase of construction, some of them complete, that are waiting years to get connected to the grid.
Okay, so it's not truly flipping a switch, but we could say in relative terms, this is basically flipping a switch.
Yeah, compared to just building a whole new power plant, this would be much quicker because they're basically bringing these shut down power plants back online.
Okay.
Are the modular reactors subject to the same regulatory red tape as the large reactors? Yes, as far as I understand, they are. And the Trump administration has been Christopher Wright, who's the Secretary of Energy, has talked about this, and they're trying to, I think, change that regulatory structure for small modular reactors. I forget the name of the company. The Oklo, they're the ones that are supposed to have one of these online by 2027 for a commercially viable small modular reactor, and they are saying that the Trump administration is telling them or signaling to them that they're trying to change this too. So we might see some changes specifically to make it easier to test and build these small modular reactors. All right. If we don't have any more questions, that'll do it for us today. We'll be back with you at 08 Central tomorrow. Be safe and stay out front.